Educators, have you ever found yourself standing in a classroom uncertain of what your internal reaction is, but feeling like you can't focus on what's happening because of what your internal world is telling you? Or have you ever noticed a student who seems to just be disconnected or uninterested or having a reaction that doesn't seem to fit the circumstance that's currently going on? I'm Caroline Poland from Poland & Associates Consulting, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about the window of tolerance and educational settings. So now let's look at what using the window of tolerance looks like with students in the classroom. So I want to remind you, if we are outside of our window of tolerance, it's going to be very hard for a student to stay in theirs. Meaning, if we're yelling, it's going to be very hard for a student to stay in that healthy window of tolerance. And so again, this is what calls us to constant work on ourselves so that we can meet students in teaching, in correcting, in do-overs, in classroom management from that well-regulated window of tolerance, instead of us engaging in those things outside of our window. And that'll give students the best opportunity that they have to learn and to correct behavior and to change and to imagine from a regulated place from their window of tolerance as well. So when we're talking to students, we want to make sure that we are matching our verbal cues, our nonverbal cues, our body posture, our facial muscles, the softness in our eyes, all of those things, that tone of our voice to what the situation is calling for. All of those verbal and nonverbal cues from ourselves will be perceived by students and will be a cue that will either allow them to stay in that window of tolerance or will kick them into a perception of a threat, which will increase the likelihood that they will go outside of their window of tolerance. So that's one really helpful thing right off the bat that we can do to help students stay in their window of tolerance, which also helps us to stay in our window of tolerance. So we really want to match what we want students to do so that they have the option to co-regulate off of that. We also want to be very curious about what the nonverbal cues are for our students that they've gotten outside of their window of tolerance. Things like yawning or blinking often, or maybe just falling asleep or disconnecting, going flat, getting angry, runners from the classroom, anxiousness, shaking, wringing their hands. All of those sorts of things are cues potentially that a student has gotten outside of their window of tolerance. And so by being that curious noticer and observer of our students, we'll be able to pick up on some of those more subtle nonverbal cues, and we'll be able to create an intervention for the class that will allow that student to get back into their window of tolerance. So make sure that you're thinking through what those nonverbal cues are that you're looking for as you're standing in front of a classroom or walking around helping students, or over Zoom as you're having a conversation with students. As I talk through these strategies for utilizing the window of tolerance in the classroom, I want you to think about how you can incorporate this into a known routine and a rhythm of predictability for students. So maybe this is part of a morning activity that starts off the day. Maybe you use some of these activities that we'll talk about as part of a transition period between subjects for students. But you want to help them have a rhythm of known predictability and routine that also will allow you to better stay in your window of tolerance as well. So my first strategy for utilizing the window of tolerance in the educational setting is that we just need to do good education on what the window of tolerance is, what that healthy zone and range looks like, and what it looks like when we go above or below that window of tolerance. And again, we'll have to talk about this regularly and in age-appropriate ways. Obviously, if you are in young elementary, that's going to have to be very simplified. And if you're an educator in a higher ed institution, that can obviously be at a much higher and complex level. But we want to do regular education on this subject and look at what it looks like when people get above and below. Again, what are those symptoms? So a summary of those symptoms is here. We want to talk about those symptoms and then what we can do to bring ourselves back into that window of tolerance. We want to normalize the fact that we all have a window of tolerance and we all get above and below that window of tolerance sometimes, and there doesn't need to be shame when we become dysregulated. We can empower students to know that they're outside of that window of tolerance. We can meet them where they're at and walk alongside of them as they get themselves back into that healthy zone and range that they can optimally function in. So we want to normalize that process and reduce shame. My second strategy is to incorporate regular check-ins and mindful moments throughout the day. Sometimes students are going to be outside of that window of tolerance or dissociating, and you might not know that. As an educator, you're not always going to be able to tell that someone is outside of their window of tolerance. And so by incorporating regular check-ins and mindful moments throughout the day, maybe in between different classes or partway through seat work or regular moments during a test in case someone's prefrontal cortex has gone offline, those things will allow you to be that external regulator that will allow that student to come back to the present moment where they can regulate and get a little bit more in that window of tolerance so they can learn effectively, so that they can be creative, so that they can remember what they've studied. They can get out of a trauma trigger or a flashback if that's what's happening. Anything like that is helpful. By doing that, you're modeling that we all need to work on our window of tolerance regularly, and that is just a normal thing. So by incorporating this multiple times throughout the day, you're not only setting students up for success, you're also allowing yourself to regulate at different moments throughout the day. But more than anything, you're being that healthy role model for students in recognizing what emotional regulation looks like, and you're normalizing that and helping to reduce shame. You can follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Poland and Associates, and my website polandandassociates.com, and subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss out on future videos.